Good afternoon. Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, U.S. history students, depending on when you're watching this. So, this is to get you the lecture question answers. This is the Volume 5, Chapter 9, pages 217 to 273 lecture questions for Unit 13. And Unit 13, Second Reconstruction and Nixon through Reagan. We'll get a little bit more into like the presidents from Nixon through Reagan. That gets in that comes up more in your reading questions than these lecture questions. And also in that context, we'll get a little bit of why the term Second Reconstruction is here. Okay, so first of all, number one, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the 1950s and 1960s? It should be 1960s on your question. And it's this guy, Earl Warren. Earl Warren. And his court was known as the Warren Court. He was at one point the governor of California, and then he was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Eisenhower, and he served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1953 to 1969. And the Supreme Court under him was arguably the most power that the Supreme Court took in working to transform the nation through the power of the Supreme Court. And a few court cases here that kind of demonstrate that. So, for example, number two, what court case declared it unconstitutional for states to have separate school facilities for black and white students? That was this one. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka is the full title. Oftentimes it's just called Brown versus the Board of Education. Again, court cases are titled based on who was doing the suing, or in other words, who the plaintiff is, and then who is defending themselves in court. And this was in 1954. And the court case involved whether or not it was okay for schools to have, well, for there to be racially segregated schools. So schools that were just white students and schools that were just black students. And this phrase, equal but separate, was one that was used by those who were defending racial segregation of schools. They were saying, no, 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 there's nothing wrong with what we're doing because we are offering equally good education, equally good facilities to the black students as we are to the white students. But if nothing else, one thing that was brought up as a challenge to that was commute distance, or how far away the school was to where the people lived, because oftentimes the schools for the white students were much more centrally located, much easier to get to, and the schools for or the black students had to travel a lot farther. Just one example of something where the equal but separate didn't really hold up. And this court case said that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. And it was challenged by some of the states, as far as some of the states tried to use National Guard. You can actually see some law enforcement here. Although this one, I think, is a case of no. This was the Little Rock, Arkansas Central School, and it was the Little Rock Nine, I think, is what they're called. The nine African American students who were the first to go to what had been up to that point an all-white school. And you can see by the looks and the shouts that a lot of people were upset about it. It really is, it's just sad. The divide and the viewpoint that a lot of people had just based on the color of a person's skin. It's despicable. But yeah. So that was number two. Number three, what happened to prayer and Bible reading in public schools in 1962 and 1963? Well, that relates to these two court cases, Engel versus Vital, and then Abington School District versus Shemp. And what they said is they said that group Bible reading and prayer, those two things, were unlawful in public schools. So a person could not read from the Bible aloud to a group, or a teacher could not read from the Bible. And then also, one thing that was kind of common in schools up to that point was something like a recitation of the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of a class period. There was another prayer called Regent's Prayer that was popular in some schools as well. And then, so yeah, what happened to prayer and Bible reading in public schools in 1962 and 1963? They were made illegal. And then what was the justification for these decisions? Well, they said that it violated the establishment of religion and the First Amendment. Establishment of religion, what the argument was to say, oh, well, if a teacher reads from, so if anything that receives, really just about anything that receives government funding does anything that promotes religion, then that is a violation of the First Amendment, not or saying that Congress shall not do anything to establish religion. But it's a total disregard for what an establishment of religion meant when the Bill of Rights was written. An establishment of religion meant that the U.S. government could not declare a religion, a denomination, to be the official religion or the official denomination of the United States. I don't know about you, but if a teacher reads from the Bible, or if a teacher prays, or if a student leads a group of students in a prayer, like for example, if a valedictorian giving a speech at a public school wants to pray briefly, that is not the U.S. government establishing an official religion or denomination for the country. So, but yeah, people have changed what the First Amendment means, and people have changed what it means to have an establishment of religion to say, oh, if anything that receives government funding does anything that promotes religion, that is the government establishing religion. So, yeah. So 1962 and 1963, yeah. Bible reading and prayer made unlawful in public schools. There's there's recently been a little bit of pushback on that from the Trump administration on allowing a little bit more freedom for student-led things that do involve prayer and Bible reading. Okay, number 4. What did Gideon versus Wainwright require? Well, you can summarize it this way. So this is a 1963 court case that attorneys must be provided in criminal cases for defendants who cannot afford them. Attorneys must be provided in criminal cases for defendants who cannot afford them. This relates to the fact that the Constitution says that people have the right to defend themselves in court with an attorney. And the interpretation became, oh, well, if people have the right to have an attorney, but if they can't afford an attorney, then the government should pay for an attorney for them. And it's kind of an ironic thing because when a person is charged with a crime, it is the local government, the city or county government that is, or the state. Why am I? It might depend on what the nature of the crime is, but I want to say mainly city or county that is prosecuting them, that is charging them, that is bringing the case against them. And yet, then it's also the government, whatever level it is, that is paying for the criminal's defense attorney. And so it's kind of like, yeah, the government is both prosecuting them and paying for the attorney to defend them, kind of a thing. I'm not super opposed to this, but it's not inappropriate reading to say that if someone has the right to something, then it must be provided for them. Also, this kind of gets into an area where some see a whatchamacallit, kind of systemic racism in the law enforcement system because oftentimes, well, usually, if a person can pay for a really good lawyer, the really good lawyer is really good because he or she can win cases a lot more often. Whereas if a lawyer is less expensive, usually it's because he or she is not quite as good. Why? Because not as good at winning cases. And well, the government is usually not going to pay for a really expensive attorney. It's going to pay for a less expensive attorney if a criminal cannot afford one. And so if a criminal cannot afford one, he or she gets a slightly less good attorney Therefore, he or she is a little bit less likely to win the case and get out, from under the charges that he's facing. And so some say that, well, minorities in general are less likely to be able to afford their own attorney. Therefore, they are more likely to get the state appointed attorney. Therefore, they are less likely to win the case than a wealthier person who is more likely to be white. And so the system is racist. And I can kind of see what they're saying, but yeah, I mean, I would, and this kind of relates to the next slide as well. I would love to see the wealth gap between um, racial minorities and white people in the United States closed. But the biggest thing statistically that is a hindrance to that is single family or single parent households. And that is one huge area where I think there can be, well, I just would love to see. But then that raises the topic of drug enforcement laws, and there are just a lot of sticky issues here. Okay, I'm going to move on. Number 5. What were some of the results of Miranda versus Arizona? Uh, well, generally speaking, is that people must be informed that things they say can be used against them in court. And really, you can just put that as your only answer. What it led to was the Miranda warning. That's the whole thing. Like, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. And if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. That comes from Gideon versus Wainwright. So that general Miranda warning, or in particular, the court case was more focused on that people must be informed that things they say can be used against them in court. So that would be number 5. Okay, next slide. Here we get into some stuff involving the civil rights movement. So number 6, what does NAACP stand for? The NAACP here, it's the bottom right, is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There are a variety of things that they've been involved with throughout their history since 1909. A lot of what they do now is stuff like scholarships for African American students to help them be able to pay for college. A variety of other things as well, but that's a lot of their involvement now. Let's see. Number 7. What famous woman sparked black activism by refusing to move to the rear of an Alabama bus? That's here and there. It's Rosa Parks. Rosa, Rosa. Oh, I have it spelled there. Rosa Parks. Yeah, buses were also segregated at the time. There's a separate section in the back. And the way a lot of them worked was an African American could sit anywhere on the bus, but then if a white person came on, then the African American was supposed to move to the back of the bus. And she decided to, I mean, take a stand, um, or the opposite of that, and not stand and move to the back of the bus. And she ended up being prosecuted for that, for refusing to do so. And what it led to was 1954, I think, the Alabama bus boycott, where African Americans boycotted public transportation in the state of Alabama, at least in the city of where she was. It was Birmingham, right? And it was some considered to be the first main protest or slash boycott of the civil rights movement. That's number 7. Number 8. Who became the primary figurehead and spokesman for the civil rights movement in the 1960s? That is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. I can anticipate the questions right now. Mr. French, do we have to spell out his whole name? Or can we just put MLKJ? And yeah, please go ahead and spell out his whole name. Martin Luther King Jr. Uh, what to say about it? So this was one of the marches in Washington D.C. Huge, huge, huge crowds would come to hear him speak. And obviously, you're a little bit familiar, if nothing else, because of the snippets from it that you've memorized in American Lit. If you haven't yet, you will soon. From his I Have a Dream speech and his Christmas speech on peace. And unlike some at the time, he took the outwardly let's pursue peaceful ways of getting equal treatment and better rights for African Americans. I say at least outwardly because there's a little bit of there's it appears that behind the scenes he was helping to promote some of the revolutionary methods. A little tidbit is that he is one of two individuals to have federal holidays named after them, or federal holidays based on them. Because there's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and then the other one is Columbus Day. Um, George Washington's birthday and Abraham Lincoln's birthday used to be holidays, but they got kind of combined and lumped in as just President's Day. So that leaves just, Martin Luther King Jr. and Christopher Columbus as the two individuals to have federal holidays named after them. I have mixed feelings about Martin Luther King Jr. as well. On the one hand, I really, I think it's great a lot of the stuff that happened because of him. However, I'm not a big fan of the reverential treatment that a lot of people give him, especially around MLKJ Day, from the standpoint of like he was such a godly Christian man, when the evidence is so far from the truth about where he stood morally and just what type of stuff he would do. I think just like with anyone, the quote unquote heroes of history, we need to be careful of having a well balanced view, not overly emphasizing the downsides, but also not kind of turning into a saint when the reality is just that is not the kind of life that the person lived. Yeah. All right. That was number 8. Number 9, we are going to get to in a moment. Also, number 10. Number 11, where and when. Oh, nope, we're going to get to that one in a second as well. Number 12, what black Muslim leader supported violent revolutions for improving black rights? That's Malcolm X. That's Malcolm X. The X, there were some who changed their last name, or at least kind of took on a last name of X as a way of saying our last name, either we chose our last name or our last name was given to us after slavery. And we don't know what our actual surname, what our actual family name would be. So, because of that unknown, given our history from slavery, we are just going to take on X as our last name. Some went the direction of taking on Muslim related names. So, for example, there was Cassius Clay, the very, very well known boxer that is better known now as Muhammad Ali. There's also, I'm trying to remember, I think I remember this guy's given name, but I'm double checking. Yeah, there's Lou Alcindor, or Ferdinand Louis Alcindor, that better became known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the legendary basketball player for the Los Angeles Lakers. So those are two examples where, as some of these people converted to Islam, they took on Muslim names. And one of the push, or one of the draws for converting to Islam, was Islam promises a future where racism will not be a thing and where all races will receive equal treatment. And so because of with the civil rights movement, there are quite a few involved in it who decided to go that direction. Even Malcolm X, he was super heavily involved with the Nation of Islam, which is kind of political and religious organization for Islamic African Americans. And even this newspaper he's holding up here is Muhammad Speaks. It's a Muslim paper. Okay, so that was number 12, Malcolm X. And then number 13, what African American leftist revolutionary group was formed in the 1960s? That's the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers. They're kind of covering up a little bit as Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And you can see they are fairly heavily armed, and they did not shy away from using violence to promote their cause. Now, in the context of self-defense, they would have looked at things like lynchings and just in general derogatory treatment and said that we should use any and all amounts of violence to protect and defend ourselves and our rights. There was that, and then I feel like there was one other thing I was going to say about that, but I don't remember for sure. There's a current. Oh, yeah. Sometimes they would also try to sway elections a little bit by being armed right outside of polling locations. There's a new Black Panther, but historians and like people who were involved with the original Black Panthers like, that's a different Black Panther group. They kind of want to make it seem like they're just a continuation of the original Black Panthers, but they're technically not the same group. But that new Black Panther group was doing a little bit of the same thing. There were armed Black Panther members pretty close to polling locations when Barack Obama was being elected. So using, I'm not aware of any of those that actually broke into violence, and I think I don't remember for sure if there were any arrests there because it's not legal to not clearly enough, not legal to try to use intimidation or violence in order to sway people to to vote a certain way or to keep people from voting because they don't feel safe. Um, but yeah, just another example of kind of using violence to promote their cause. All right, there are a couple of questions that we skipped are on this next slide about the Vietnam War. So I don't have his name here, but I can. Yeah, I'll just have to spell it out for you. So this is number 9. Who became the communist leader of North Vietnam? His name was Ho Chi Minh. Ho spelled Ho. Chi Chi. Minh Minh. I'm pretty sure, but let me double check. Oh, Minh. That's right. Yeah. Ho Ho Chi Chi Minh Minh. Ho Chi Minh. So that was number 9. Number 10, who are the guerrillas who fought against America and South Vietnam? That was this one, the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong. So here's the gist of what's going on. We're talking approximately 1965 to 1975 that the United States was heavily involved in the war. There was some involvement starting as early as 1954, but actual Marines on the ground in Vietnam, I think, started in 1965. So Vietnam, we're looking at Asia in general here, right? So you have Japan, there's North and South Korea there, really close to Japan. And here's the Soviet Union up here. Mongolia, it was not always under Soviet control, but sometimes. And then the Communist China here, People's Republic of China. Then down here in Southeast Asia, you have Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. That's that CAMB there, Cambodia. And then over here, hugging the right hand side of this peninsula, close to the Philippines. So Korea is close to Japan. Vietnam is close to the Philippines. You have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And North Vietnam was communist, heavily supported, influenced by Communist China and the Soviet Union. And then South Vietnam was free, or more capitalist. You have a little bit more of a detailed look here: North Vietnam, South Vietnam. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, ended up for a while being called Ho Chi Minh City. There's that Ho Chi Minh that I was referencing earlier. I felt like that name was on this map somewhere that I could point out, but I forgot exactly where. Countries that were supporting North Vietnam, mainly China and the Soviet Union. Countries supporting South Vietnam, mainly United States and Australia and New Zealand. A few others as well. I ranked these, I listed these in order of most number of troops involved in the war to least number of troops. So on the North Vietnamese side, there's North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and basically they were guerrilla fighters. They were oftentimes they would not wear a uniform. They would not be operating under like usual and traditional military, way of going about things. They would they would what's how am I trying to put it? They would just kind of fit in with the locals. Sometimes they would use tactics like strapping a bomb to a child and having the child walk in near where there were American soldiers. Actually, I read this one account of some American soldiers who are hanging out, and one of them all of a sudden grabs his rifle and shoots his kid. And at first, the others were like, "What in the world are you doing?" And when they took a closer look, yep, the kid had a bomb strapped to him that was just about to go off. And the reason the American soldier recognized that as a threat is the kid was wearing shoes, and he knew that the locals wouldn't have been wearing shoes, whether it be because of just that was the norm. Um, yeah. And he figured that this kid has shoes because the Viet Cong has provided shoes for him because he needs to walk for a little ways to get to where we are. But there was just terrible and tragic stuff that was part of the war, like that story that I just told. China, and then the Khmer Rouge, that was the communist group in Cambodia. Cambodia, again, is this one right here, and the Soviet Union. And then on the South Vietnamese side, the United States, the Khmer Republic, those were the non communists in Cambodia. Laos is, again, this one right here, kind of tucked in between Vietnam and Thailand, and then South Korea. All right, so we already mentioned around 1965 to 1975. In total, about 2.7 million U.S. troops fought in the war. The most at any one time was around 500 to 600,000, but total throughout the course of the war, 2.7 million troops. And one of the reasons there were as many was because of the draft, which we'll talk about in a second. But a draft being everyone, all males of a certain age have to register, and the United States is kind of a random lottery to see who they are going to say, sorry, you don't have a choice. You are now in the military and you are going to fight in this war. My dad was drafted for the Vietnam War. He got the notice that he'd been drafted, and he just basically he packed his bags and he said goodbye to his mom and figured, hopefully I'll see you again. I'm leaving to join the army and I'm going to go fight in the Vietnam War and hopefully I come back. In his case, what happened was he went for all the physicals to make sure that he was physically well enough to join the military, and his knees were in bad shape, which he knew from playing sports that yeah, he at least one of his knees, if not both of them, different times would pop out of joint when he was playing basketball, and he'd have to pop it back into joint. And yes, the doctors were basically, yeah, there's no way you can do all the marching and running and stuff like that with like 80 pounds on your back that soldiers have to do. So we're gonna send you back home. The U.S. about 58,000 deaths. South Vietnamese, though, around 200 to 400,000 civilian deaths and 300,000 military deaths. And then North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, those combined, there were about 100,000 civilian deaths and about 850,000 military deaths. And a few things that characterized the war. There was the draft. I just talked about that a little bit. Fragging. So fragging was basically this. If you survived your first roughly 6 months in Vietnam, there was a very high percentage that you would survive until you were done. Either you had served your time or the war ended. The majority of deaths were in the first, few months of being there. Of just some people had a knack for being able to survive, and some didn't. And what would happen sometimes is a group of guys, officer, would get injured and would have to go, and they'd be sent a fresh officer. A fresh officer, maybe like straight from West Point, something like that, who had a lot of book learning, but maybe or maybe not was very well cut out to be able to survive what this war was like. And thus, if he was not very well cut out, he might make decisions that were very, very bad for his men. And so what happens sometimes is a new officer would get appointed, and the men would get a sense pretty quickly of what's this guy like, and how likely is he to make dumb decisions that are going to get us killed and himself killed. And if they concluded that he was pretty likely to make dumb decisions that would get them all killed, sometimes at night, one person would take a grenade, pull the pin, toss it in the general area of where the officer was sleeping, but far enough away not to be deadly, but just close enough to injure the officer enough to where he would get sent home, to where he wouldn't be able to keep fighting, so that the group would get sent another officer that they hoped would be one who would not make decisions that would get them all killed. So, yeah, that was the thing. There are all the helicopters here because helicopters were heavily used by the United States in the war. It was essentially a new cavalry. Instead of using horses, we were going to ride into the area on helicopters. And then drugs. There were times of the war where there were like 3 times as many American soldiers receiving medical treatment because of using drugs than needing medical treatment because of actual injuries from the war. Yeah. And then, so what ended up happening is U.S. just ended up withdrawing. There was very low public support for the war in the United States. And I'm glad that we've grown quite a bit as a society from where things were in the Vietnam War. Because during the Vietnam War, a lot of people who did not agree with the war took it out on the soldiers. And again, oftentimes the soldiers were drafted. They didn't decide to join the military. And so you'd have like stuff like a soldier who got drafted, went and fought for a long time in the war, and then got injured in a way that like his leg had to get amputated, and that bandaged up, and he's finally healed up enough for him to come back home. He lands in the United States, gets into the airport, and he has people like spitting on him and calling him a murderer and stuff like that. And people really took their dislike for the war out on the soldiers. And I'm glad that wars that we have fought more recently, there's been more of a characteristic of people who don't agree with the war will still say, "I support the troops," and if I think that is a much better of a perspective. So the United States ended up withdrawing. And as a result of that, the communists took control of South Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. But then this also saw the 26th Amendment. It was kind of a reason why the 26th Amendment got passed. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. And the reason why is because a lot of people are like, dude, if a guy can risk his life fighting a war for our country at 18 years old, he should be able to have a voice to vote for who the elected leaders are who declare wars. And so, yeah, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. So that's number 14. Number 14. What is the 26th Amendment? And it lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. Okay. Let's see. Number 11, we still need to go over is where and when was the first student uprising of the 1960s? I don't have a separate slide for that. The where is UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley. Berkeley spelled Berkeley. 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 UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And the when, don't worry about the when. Just the where is good because the question kind of mentions a little the gist of the when, the 1960s. Students having protests were a growing thing in popularity in the 1960s. It was kind of part of the counterculture. Counterculture doesn't come up in this context, but it does on our final exam study guide. We'll get to it a little bit later. But it was basically, among other things, a desire to throw off the morals and to throw off the ideas of their parents' generation. And so, as part of the counterculture, that you had tons of drug use. Although the drug use, unlike today, the drug use is more of just because it feels good. A lot of the drug use then was because people viewed it as a means to greater enlightenment, a means to like a kind of a spiritual revelation that was beyond what they could experience and what they could understand and know without the drugs. So drugs, as well as free love of just trying to make uh, the normalization of sex outside of marriage a thing of just being like people could just make love because they just love each other. It should be something that is just reserved to the structure and confines of marriage. So a variety of things like that came up as part of the counterculture. Okay, next one: resurgence of conservatism. So the United States had, in varying degrees at varying times, but been going in more of a progressive direction of a lot larger of a government, a lot more government intervention, a lot more government control, a lot more government programs. And it was around this time, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that there was a growing popularity of saying, no, that's not a good direction for us to go. And we think more of a limited government and more of a free market economy, less of a moving in the direction of socialism kind of a economy is the way to go. So, number 15, what book, written by whom, was first published in 1944 and became a very widely read defense of conservative economic policies? Well, the book is this one, The Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom. And the written by whom? Friedrich A. Hayek. Friedrich Hayek. And a few of the things that it says, some key points. First of all, about socialism, it said that it uses restraint and servitude to supposedly grant equalities. Like at face value, socialism says we just want people to be equal. But in order to create that, what does it use? Restraint and servitude. And so people end up not being free. And that's kind of the related to the title, The Road to Serfdom. Serfs, again, the lowest rung in feudalism. About free market and democracy, the book said that it seeks equality in liberty. And then in general about free market, it said that it's superior, quote, because it is the only method by which our activities can be adjusted to each other without coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. So that's that one. And then number 16, name two literature authors and books that discussed utopianism. Well, one author is George Orwell. George Orwell. And there are two different books of his. One is Animal Farm. And one quote from Animal Farm is so Animal Farm is kind of a critique of communism where it portrays communism getting put into effect by the animals on a farm, and the pigs are in charge. Anyway, it says all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that's kind of poking fun at the communist viewpoint of like all people are equal. but just some of us get much, much, much better treatment and much, much, much more of the cut of everything because some of us are more equal than others. Kind of a, yeah, it doesn't make sense, and that's the point. Also, the further a society drifts from truth, the more it will have those that speak it, the more it will hate those that speak it. The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those that speak it. And then the other book that you can mention from by George Orwell is 1984. And some things that come up in 1984 is if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And the society there in 1984 had this mantra: the war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And then Big Brother is watching you. Big Brother was the government's surveillance of the people in 1984. All right. So, yeah. So, George Orwell, 1984. And then the other one is Ayn Rand. Here, Ayn Rand is the author. That's her. She was born in Russia, ended up coming to the United States. Ayn Rand, and the book is Atlas Shrugged. And the title Atlas Shrugged, this relates to the title. If you saw Atlas, the giant who holds the world on his shoulders, if you saw that he stood, blood running down his chest, his knees buckling, his arms trembling, but still trying to hold the world aloft with the last of his strength, and the greater his effort, the heavier the world bore down upon his shoulders, what would you tell him? And this other character replies, I don't know. What could he do? What would you tell him? And the person responds, to shrug. And what's going on, and this relates again to the title of the book, is she's describing the industrialists, the hardworking, the people who started and owned businesses, and at times the word is also used for kind of a separate group, the geniuses, the industrialists and the geniuses of the world, as being the ones who figuratively hold the world up. It's their effort, their activity, their hard work, their ideas that keep the world propped up. And that if those people decided to shrug, in other words, to stop putting in the hard work and effort that they do, then the world would come crumbling down. She also said another point: there is no honest revolt against reason. The only way you can revolt against reason is dishonestly. She was an atheist. There are certain things of hers that I agree with, and certain things that I definitely don't. Certain things that are biblical, certain things that are not biblical. I when I set up this PowerPoint, I really did not want it to seem like Ayn Rand has one whole slide. She's just as important as the Vietnam War or the Civil Rights Movement, but it's just kind of how the design went. And yeah, I have one video here. This is put on by something like the Ayn Rand Foundation or the Ayn Rand Institute, something like that. And it's kind of a 2-minute explanation of her viewpoints. And I think hopefully you'll see where some of her viewpoints were biblical, but some are not very good.
Objectivism. It's a guide to living here. Developed by this writer. Wondering who needs a philosophy? She answered that. To deal with real life, we need a view of the world and our place in it. Now, some people have strong opinions on objectivism. It's a philosophy that's controversial because it advocates selfishness and says altruism is evil. But we'll get back to that. Rand's philosophy looks something like this. It starts with the idea that reality is objective. The universe is what it is, not what we want it to be. And wishing otherwise won't make it so. Next, it states that our reason is all we have and all we need for understanding the world around us. And if reason is an absolute, you can't accept contradictions. It also says your highest moral purpose should be the pursuit of your own selfish happiness. Now, selfishness can be misinterpreted. It doesn't mean exploit others for your own gain. It means realize your highest potential by pursuing rational ends and live in harmony with others by respecting their right to their own life and happiness. The result of this philosophy is a life of reason, purpose, self-esteem, a philosophy for living on earth.
If you know that this life is all that you have, wouldn't you make the most of it?
So let's see, biblical or unbiblical? There is an objective reality and truth. Yeah, okay, good. Um, Reason is all we have for understanding and knowing the truth. No. Um, you should pursue your own happiness. Well, this one, it depends. If you define happiness as the way that we truly can be happy and doing what we were created to do, then by pursuing our own happiness, what you're talking about is loving, worshiping, following, and serving God. And that is the way to the greatest and most and best happiness. So if you define it within the constraints of what the Bible would say, then I can say, yes, pursuing our own happiness is what we should do. But if you deviate at all from what true happiness would be, then no, definitely don't agree with it. Let's see. This life is all that you have, so make the most of it. Well, if you mean there is no afterlife, then no. But if you mean that this is the life that God has given to us, and so make the most of the life that you have, well, then yeah. So, very mixed bag. But yeah, her book Atlas Shrugged is still very highly regarded. It's huge. It's very long, but a lot of conservatives, like economic and political conservatives, point to a lot of stuff that it has to say. Although it does have its shortcomings again. Okay, so that was number 16. Number 17, what author and commentator was the leading intellectual spokesman for conservatism in America in the second half of the 20th century? I thought about doing some stuff about him, but I decided not to, so I'm going to let you omit number 17. And I believe I have now covered everything from this, right? Let me just give it a quick 1 yes, 2 yes, 3 yes, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And we're omitting 17. And then now that we're at the end, you can say yes to number 18. Okay. See you next time.